Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we have taken up Delhi edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 9th of April 2022. The articles which we are going to cover today have been displayed on this screen, and let us now begin the discussion.
The first news which we have taken for today's discussion appears on page number 1, and rightly so. SC upholds new restrictions on receiving foreign funds. So the context is that Supreme Court yesterday upheld amendments in introducing restrictions in the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, while holding that no one has fundamental or absolute right to receive foreign contribution. And this judgment may hit non-governmental organizations working at the grassroots level with no direct link to foreign donors. So NGOs or non-governmental organizations work independently and without any pecuniary or financial or very minimal financial aid from the government, although they function with the government agencies in close coordination for executing their projects. Therefore, the roles and functions of NGO in India is a really significant one and serve the major purpose of development and growth. And that is not the only reason we are going to cover this news in detail. There is another reason as well. If you look at GS paper 2, which deals with polity and governance, you have a line in the syllabus which says development processes and development industry, the role of NGOs. And hence, it becomes our duty to cover not just NGOs, but any particular amendment or act or policy measure which is going to impact their functioning in a major way. And this is that particular moment, because FCRA Act 2010 was enacted to regulate the NGOs in our country, especially the ones which are receiving the foreign funding. That is why the name of the act was Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. But at the same time, later on, it was felt that some other changes might be necessary because of various reports by CBI and Intelligence Bureau. And hence, the government came up with Amendment Act 2021, which contained a lot of provisions against which NGO went to the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court has upheld the amendment. And so we are going to discuss all these dimensions in the upcoming discussion. So before anything, let us first understand, why is there any need for regulating the NGOs or non-governmental organizations? Now, NGOs as a term taken together do not look like a harmful section of the society. But various reports, including reports of CBI and Intelligence Bureau, have shown the misappropriation of funds by a large number of NGOs, which could cost India around 2 to 3% of its GDP. And hence, there is a need for ensuring accountability on behalf of NGOs. But apart from that, there is a need for transparency in the way the funds are being managed at NGOs. And again, CBI investigation and its reports submitted before the Supreme Court has stated that less than 10% of the 29 lakh registered NGOs across the country file their annual income and expenditure. So rest 90% of the NGOs and what they are doing with their funds is basically unknown. And so, in order to ensure accountability and transparency, it is much needed that they be brought under the regulation. And they have been under FCRA Act 2010. Then at the same time, since they are impacting our society and a country as a whole in a big way, in a major way, it is important to ensure independence of their functioning, autonomy of themselves, and reliability of the organizational structures of the NGOs. For instance, questions are frequently raised regarding the role and composition of the board, financial accounting being adopted at NGOs. All these elements, which are extremely important for any organization which works for public cause, is important for all of us to know. Then apart from that, there is a constitutional mandate as well behind such a regulation. Since the NGOs receive public funds, it is important that people have the right to information under Article 21 to know about the usage of those funds. And so I guess these three are the reasons sufficient enough to call for regulation. And so Parliament enacted FCRA Act 2010 or 2010, which is basically Foreign Contribution Regulation Act 2010, acronymed as FCRA. That regulates the acceptance and utilization of foreign contribution by individuals, associations, and companies. And foreign contribution is defined as the donation or transfer of any currency, security, or article by a foreign source. So as far as the provisions of FCRA 2010 is concerned, these are the only two dimensions which you need to know. that it regulates the acceptance and utilization of foreign contribution by individuals, associations, and companies. And foreign contribution is defined as any currency, security, or any article transferred from a foreign agent. Now, the next question which might arise in your mind is that when already an act exists, what was the need to amend this particular act? And the need for amendment was felt because of two reasons. The first one was that there was a need to regulate non-government organizations and make them more accountable as well as more transparent, and the provisions of 2010 Act were not proving to be sufficient. At the same time, with the change of the government in 2014, a special emphasis was laid on regulating religious conversions in the lure of money. It was believed that a lot of foreign funding is being diverted to NGOs to convert a lot of people, especially in tribal areas. And then finally, there was a need to ensure that foreign money is not being utilized against the national interest and economic development of our country, and because of which the government had to come up with an amendment to ensure that these two objectives are met by the statute. Let us now discuss these amendments and then finally the issues with the amendment. Now, just to let you know that prohibition on accepting of foreign contribution, transfer of foreign contribution, documentation for registration, FCRA account, and suspension of registration are the provisions which already existed in the Act. But what the new Amendment Act has done, that it has modified some of these features, and let us now discuss them. For example, under the Act, election candidates, editor or publisher of a newspaper, judges, government servants, members of any legislature are prohibited to accept any foreign contribution. So these people were already debarred from receiving any foreign funds. But the new Amendment Act adds public servant to this list. Public servant includes any person who is in service or pay of the government or remunerated by the government for the performance of any public duty. And so it has a much wider connotation as compared to just the government servants. Then it has made certain changes into the transfer of foreign contribution as well. Because under the Act, foreign contribution cannot be transferred to any other person unless such person is also registered to accept foreign contribution. So basically, if I receive foreign funds and if I have to give it to someone else, that person has to be first registered or eligible to receive foreign funds, and then I can transfer those funds. But now, under the Amendment Act, such transfer has been prohibited. So even if that person is registered, you cannot transfer the funds received from foreign to another entity. Then there are changes with respect to the documentation for registration as well. Amendment adds that any person seeking prior permission, registration must provide Aadhaar number of all its office bearers, directors. In case of a foreigner, they must provide a copy of their passport or the Overseas Citizens of India card for identification. Then a very unique condition has been imposed on foreign contribution and its receival. So amendment states that foreign contribution must be received only in an account designated by the bank as FCRA account in such branch of the SBI within New Delhi as notified by the Home Ministry central government. So the central government will come up with a notification designating a particular branch of SBI in Delhi where all the NGOs receiving foreign funds will have to open an account, and foreign funds can be only received in that particular account. Then the last important provision is with respect to suspension of registration. So under the Act, the government may suspend the registration of a person for a period not exceeding 180 days only. But amendment adds that such suspension may be extended up to an additional 180 days. So in total, an NGO's license can be suspended for around a year, 360 days. So although it is true that these changes in the way these NGOs are receiving foreign funds was much needed, but at the same time, these changes or amendments have brought various concerns along with them. For example, these amendments are definitely going to constrain the accessibility to the funds, especially the foreign funds. Many NGOs will not be able to access foreign funds because the scheme under which they receive these funds from donor agencies and international NGOs has been abolished. Then, in the amendment, changes have been introduced with respect to the expenditure, the amount of expenses they can incur. The amount NGOs can spend on administration has been cut from 50% to 20%. which means many smaller NGOs will not be able to employ enough staff, hire experts, and implement strategies they require to grow. These amendments are also going to increase the cost of transaction and distance, because you know that NGOs will now have to open an account with a Delhi branch of SBI, which could be 1,000 kilometers away from NGOs and increase the transaction cost and may burden them with complicated procedures. Apart from that, there is a very basic issue about the Amendment Act as well. It was not well scrutinized because the first time it came into limelight was when it was already tabled in Lok Sabha. The draft of the bill was not in public domain until then, and so there was no public scrutiny to the bill whatsoever. And then finally, as well intentioned as it might be, it will have far reaching consequences on the fields of education, health, people's livelihood, because NGOs provide last mile connectivity for the delivery of government schemes in various fields. Now, the only thing which we haven't discussed in this particular article is what should be the way forward. It is true that as civil society organizations seek accountability from others, it is a moral obligation for them to themselves be accountable and transparent. So it is important to regulate them. But at the same time, these regulations should not curb the freedom of functioning of genuine NGOs. So let us know in the comment section, what do you think are some of the way forwards or the suggestions you could have written in your mains answer. Let us now move on to the next news. The next news which we have taken up has again appeared on page number 1. Congress internal poll process gets a renewed push. So the process to complete the organizational polls of the Congress party to elect a new party chief by September this year has received a fresh push according to the sources. Now oftentimes we read news related to the internal functioning of political parties, which has nothing to do with their public sphere. How are they electing their presidents and state leaders? How are they managing their funds? How are they distributing the tickets? Or what is the procedure they are adopting to select the candidates in elections to states and national parliament? Now you might wonder, how is this related to UPSC syllabus? Now first and foremost, if you see salient features of representation of the People's Act as a part of your syllabus, Section 29A of RPA deals with very vague provisions enforcing intra-party democracy. But for a second, just forget about UPSC syllabus or representation of the People's Act. Just think about a scenario where we want to ingrain real democracy in our country, where we just not want to ensure each and every person's right, their empowerment, but also we want representation of all the sections of the society. Do you think it would be real? It would be effective unless and until we have democracy within the parties. Because if you do not have democracy within the parties, what you have is single person or single family controlling the affairs of the party for many decades. What you have is basically criminalization of the politics, because the top leaders are not accountable to anyone as to who they are giving the tickets to. And since there is no intra-party democracy, there is lack of representation of the vulnerable sections of the society within the party as well. For example, lower number of women in politics is because there is no intra-party democracy. There is very less number of SC/ST people commanding top positions in national or regional politics. But when it comes to the real elections, you have to abide by the constitutional provisions, and that is when these parties provide tickets just to meet the constitutional requirement. And so the real democracy will be achieved if and only if India enforces intra-party democracy within the political parties, and that is what we are going to understand. So starting the discussion by first understanding what exactly do we understand by intra-party democracy or democracy within a political party. So if you broadly want to define this term, you can say that it is about implementation of a minimum set of norms within the organization of political parties. Now this minimum set of norms should provide a bottom-up approach to forming a decision in the party and the internal distribution of power at different level bodies and individuals. Because a lot of issues in our country are being faced because of the lack of rules within political parties. We never know why a person is elected continuously for 40 years as a president of political party. How are the decisions, or how is the manifesto or schemes, a program of a political party is decided within the party? Where is the actual power being located within a party? And if you compare this to that of United States of America, you can easily understand the major difference. The intra-party democracy in United States is so strong that for deciding the contender for the post of governor, president, or for becoming a party president, each and every registered member of a party votes in a county-wise manner. And on the basis of those results, these position holders are elected. And that is real intra-party democracy. But in our case, since independence, the authority in organizational matters has mostly been from the top to bottom. Leadership in most political parties in India may be democratic in appearance, but is highly centralized in reality. And the major reason behind that is that in India there is no legal provision for enforcing internal or intra-party democracy, except for very few and vague provisions given in Section 29A of Representation of the People's Act and few Election Commission guidelines, but they are not enforceable. Let us now first understand why do we need intra-party democracy in a broader sense. And so first and foremost, you need to ensure representation not just in national politics, but in political parties also. The absence of intra-party democracy has contributed to political parties becoming closed autocratic structures. Now this adversely impacts the constitutional right of all citizens to equal political opportunity to participate in politics and contest elections. Then if you have followed the newspaper closely, around the time when elections are around the corner, there is no reason given by a particular political party regarding ticket distribution. So who gets the ticket and why is known to only the party president and few people in power. And so we need transparency in ticket distribution as well, because a transparent party structure with transparent process will allow proper ticket distribution and candidate selection. The selection would not be based on whims of a few powerful leaders in the party, but will represent choice of the larger party. Then currently, the top position holders in a particular political party, and it is applicable to all the parties, are not accountable to public in general and party cadres in particular. And it is extremely important to hold them accountable to their own party structure. It helps party members to hold their leaders accountable and engage in policy decision processes meaningfully, as it would bring in competition, participation, and representation inside the political party. Then comes the issue of decentralization. Through the provisions of the Constitution, we have decentralized the state power. We have parliament at the top level, then we have legislature at the state level, and then we have third level of government or the local governance. And that is more or less sorted. But what we don't have right now is the decentralization of the political power within the party structure. Every political party, although, has a state and local body unit. And so, an election at each level will allow creation of power centers at different levels. This will allow decentralization of the power, and decision making will take place at the ground level, instead of what is happening right now, where even the local body elections and the agenda for them is set right at the party headquarters, either in Delhi or, in case of regional parties, in the regional centers. One of the biggest reasons because of which we need intra-party democracy is the increasing trend of criminalization of the politics. But this criminalization of politics has a relation with the lack of intra-party democracy. As there is no well-defined process for the distribution of the tickets to candidates before the election, tickets are given to candidates on the vague concept of winnability. This has led to an additional problem of candidates with criminal backgrounds contesting and winning a lot of elections. So much so that number of MPs with criminal charges against them is been increasing in every elections. And at the same time, the existence of intra-party democracy is going to give space for dissent within the party, reducing the possibility of formation of a number of offshoots political party and hence creating a number of regional parties. The best example of this, Chief Minister of Bengal Mamata Banerjee and prominent leader Sharad Pawar. Both of them were prominent Congress leaders and later on, due to lack of intra-party democracy, had to quit and form another regional party. Although whether large number of smaller regional parties or few numbers of national parties is good for India or bad, that is a matter of another discussion, but definitely is going to curb the trend of factionalism and formation of new regional parties. So if intra-party democracy is so good, what are the reasons or the causes behind India not having a proper culture of intra-party democracy? And there are four major reasons behind lack of intra-party democracy. The first one is the culture of dynastic politics. There is so much of emphasis on nepotism in political parties that it has totally killed the chances of providing democratic avenues to other party cadre. At the same time, the culture in India of political parties is that of a centralization of power into very few hands. And one of the main reasons behind that is the 10th schedule, or the provisions of the Anti-Defection Law of 1985, which deters party legislators from voting in national and state legislatures according to their individual preferences. It gives disproportionate amount of power to the party leaders, since they command power within legislative assembly and parliament. That power also percolates beyond the boundary of the legislatures as well. Then, as we have discussed, there is no particular law or strict provision within Representation of the People's Act to provide for or enable intra-party democracy. And somehow, in our country, we have developed a phenomenon of personality cult. There is a tendency of hero worship. And many times a leader takes over the party and builds his own coterie, ending all forms of intra-party democracy. Now, on this behalf, there exists three major recommendations from Law Commission, National Commission for Review of Working of the Constitution, and second ARC, which directly deal with the intra-party democracy. Now, when you're writing an answer in the mains exam, it's more than sufficient to just mention these three bodies or committees and just write that they have recommended institution of intra-party democracy in this regard, but it's good to know some specifics as well. For example, Law Commission's 170th report on electoral reforms dedicated an entire chapter on the necessity of providing laws relating to internal party democracy. National Commission for Review of Working of the Constitution states that there should be a comprehensive legislation regulating and registration of functioning of political parties or alliances within our country. Similarly, the ARC reports on ethics and governance, which is the fodder material for studying the ethics paper GS4, pointed out that the corruption is caused by over-centralization, since the more remotely power is exercised from the people, the greater is the distance between authority and accountability. This is also a good quote which has been given directly in ARC report. So now the question which remains is with respect to the future course of action. What should be done to ingrain intra-party democracy in our country so that it gets reflected in better outcomes overall as far as performance of our democracy is concerned? So first and foremost, as you might have guessed by now, we need a law. We need a statute which should mandate intra-party democracy, mandate internal elections, mandate voting for selection of party positions. At the same time, we should empower the Election Commission of India to ensure the implementation of that particular statute. Or maybe we can amend Representation of the People's Act and insert a new chapter dealing with elections within political parties. At the same time, we know that the provisions of anti-defection law get activated as and when a member of a party goes against the orders issued by the whip of a political party in a legislature. Now, if they are important matters, for example, no confidence motion or adjournment motion, then it makes total sense to follow the party diktats. But when there are issues related to discussion on a particular bill, then it should not be applicable. And if we do that, if we make this amendment to the 10th schedule, it is going to go a long way in ensuring intra-party democracy, better debate within a political party. Then at the same time, just reservation in the final election is not sufficient to ensure the proper representation of the all communities of the society. You need reservation within political parties. So if you are giving reservations to SCs, STs and women in various elections, there's a need to enact and make it mandatory for positions within political parties as well. Only then you are going to have better representation within political parties, which will then be reflected in overall horizon of Indian democracy. At the same time, it must be made mandatory for all political parties to submit their statements of expenditure to ECI within prescribed time limit. Political parties not submitting on time or in the prescribed format should be heavily penalized. This next news which we have taken up has again appeared on page number 1. Home Ministry seeks 6 more months to frame CAA rules, or the rules which would actually implement Citizenship Amendment Act 2019, a legislation which was enacted to fast-track citizenship processes of 6 non-Muslim undocumented communities from Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan. So the government was very adamant in passing this statute from the parliament. But it has been more than 2.5 years still there are no rules, and so this act has still not kicked in. But there are a lot of important provisions and information from the perspective of prelims examination that could be asked because of Citizenship Amendment Act 2019. So let us now discuss these perspectives. So whenever we hear about citizenship and provisions related to citizenship, the first thing which should strike the mind of a serious aspirant is what does the Constitution of India says about the provisions related to the citizenship. And if we go into just the list of the articles, Article 1, 2, 3, 4 under Part 1 deals with India, that is Union and its territories. Whereas Part 2, as you can see, clearly deals with the provisions of citizenship. Now, an interesting part about the provisions given in the Constitution with respect to citizenship is that Article 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10 deal with defining the citizens of our country at the time of the promulgation of the Constitution. They do not deal with the regulation of the citizenship, award of citizenship, taking away of the citizenship henceforth, because that is dealt with in Article 11, which says Parliament to regulate the right of citizenship by law. And that is the most important article under Part 2. Because rest every article, citizenship at the commencement of the Constitution, right of citizenship of certain persons who have migrated to India from Pakistan, rights of citizenship of certain migrants to Pakistan, rights of citizenship of certain persons of Indian origin residing outside India, these provisions are not important for us as of now, but they were extremely important when Indian Republic was starting afresh. What is relevant for us is Parliament to regulate the right of the citizenship by law. And Parliament utilized this law to come up with Citizenship Act 1955. And so let's now read this article in detail. It says, nothing in the foregoing provisions of this part shall derogate from the power of Parliament to make any provision with respect to the acquisition and termination of citizenship and all other matter relating to citizenship. So Parliament has very wide power in regulation of the citizenship of India. It has the power to enable rules for acquisition of citizenship, which means award of new citizenship to the people. And it also has the power to regulate how the citizenship will be terminated for people. And this provision is what has been utilized to come up with Citizenship Amendment Act 1955 and the Citizenship Amendment Act 2019, because of which we are taking up the news today. Now, if the Constitution has given the power to Parliament to make laws on citizenship, it should also be reflected in Schedule 7 under List 1. So let's just quickly check over it. Here you go, 7th schedule, which is an application of Article 246. List 1, Union List, contains all those items on which only and only Parliament can make laws. And as you can see, defense, military, naval, arms, fire is there, diplomatic, consular and trade relation, United Nations Organization, CBI and investigation. And as soon as you go to the item number 17, you can see citizenship, naturalization and aliens is a subject on which only Parliament can make laws. So these are two very crucial information from the perspective of prelims examination. So after having discussed the static knowledge, let us now move on to the current affairs. As you can see, Citizenship Amendment Act 2019 was passed by both Lok Sabha, Rajya Sabha and later on received the assent of the President. This was the bill because of which a lot of protests were going on in our country at that point of time. Now here we are going to keep ourselves limited only to the provisions of the bill and very minor issues or concerns with respect to the act. Whereas if you want to understand the deeper issues in the act or what ramifications it might have on the Indian populace, you will have to go and watch this DNS to understand various dimensions to the issues. But here we are going to keep ourselves limited only to the provisions of the bill. So this particular act has two main provisions, or it brings about two major amendments to the Citizenship Act 1955. So the first one is the grant of citizenship, and the second one is the process through which this citizenship shall be awarded. Now, as far as the first provision is concerned, this bill provides for citizenship to all the persecuted minorities belonging to very specifically Hindu, Parsi, Jain, Christian and Buddhist religion and coming from these three countries, which are Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan. So any person who belongs to these religions and comes from these countries only, that too before 31st of December 2014, will be eligible for Indian citizenship through the process of naturalization. Now you might ask, how will you grant a citizenship to a person in 2019 when the cutoff date was 2014. And specifically because of this, the provisions of the Amendment Act is applicable to illegal immigrants. So all those people who did not have visa but entered into Indian territory through some way or the other shows that they were persecuted or they are being persecuted in their source country, because of which they might need protection. And that is why all those immigrants who did not even have permission to enter into our country but entered before December 2014 will be eligible for naturalization as an Indian citizen. So as we just recently discussed various ways to provide citizenship, you can easily understand that these people are not born and brought up in India. These people do not come from Indian descent, and so the only way we can provide them citizenship is through the process of naturalization. It is applicable only when a person has resided in our country for 11 or more years. But if you want to give citizenship to these people who have recently migrated, you have to reduce the number of years they have resided in our country previous to 31st December 2014, and this is what Amendment Act has done. The period of residential qualification has been reduced from 11 to 6 years. So these were the two major amendments done by Citizenship Amendment Act 2019. Now it is no more relevant from the perspective of mains examination, but just for the sake of completion of the discussion, let's quickly go through two benefits and two demerits. But as you know, the detailed analysis has been done previously 2 years ago or 3 years ago. So first and foremost, of course, it is going to provide citizenship to the people who are being persecuted. They are not only persecuted, they are also minority, and so they do not have political or social capital to oppose their respective governments, be it Afghanistan, Pakistan or Bangladesh. Then it is going to benefit Chakma and Hajongs. Chakmas are Buddhist and Hajongs are Hindu people. They migrated from Bangladesh, but at the same time, if you look very closely and evaluate the provisions of the Act on constitutional basis, it looks like a violation of Article 14. Because Article 14 provides for equal protection of law along with equality before law. And you know that Article 14 is just not applicable to the citizens of our country, but also to all the people. It is uniformly applicable to everyone. And so if you are giving citizenship to persecuted minorities from Pakistan, Bangladesh and Afghanistan, why are you not extending the same provision to the persecuted minorities coming from Sri Lanka? Or for that matter, why are you only considering Hindus, Parsis, Jain, Christian and Buddhist people as persecuted minority? It is true that they are persecuted, but they are not the only one which are persecuted. You have a lot of other minority groups, for example, Ahmadiyas. They are a set of persecuted people in Pakistan, the most persecuted in fact. And so if you apply the principles of equal protection of law, which basically deals with application of same laws alike and without discrimination to all persons who are similarly situated. And so if you look at a larger scheme, a Hindu in Pakistan is similarly situated as an Ahmadiyya in Pakistan. They both are being discriminated. And so why not extend the same provisions to both of them? The only major religion which has been left out from the bill is Islam. So Muslim people coming from anywhere do not have any chance to get citizenship through the process of naturalization if they entered into territory of our country illegally or without documentation. And then finally, the provisions of the bill are going to cause threat to local demographics. And this is the reason why people in Northeast are protesting against the provision of the bill, because they think that all those illegal people coming from Bangladesh who have settled but have no citizenship will acquire citizenship, will become legal, lawful citizens of our country, and they are going to vote in upcoming elections, which is going to play a key role in how the political power is going to be distributed in 10 to 20 years from now. RBI to focus on inflation lifts estimates. So the RBI's Monetary Policy Committee on Friday raised its estimate for inflation in financial year 23 to 5.7% from the 4.5% forecast in February before Russia invaded Ukraine, and stressed that it would now turn its focus to the withdrawal of accommodation to ensure that inflation remains within the target going forward. Now inflation is one of the very important determinants of economic growth, and not just economic growth but the growth of UPSC aspirants as well, because just look at this instance from 2020 prelims examination where UPSC asks, consider the following statements. Statement 1, the weightage of food in consumer price index CPI is higher than that in wholesale price index known as WPI. Statement 2, The WPI does not capture changes in the prices of services which CPI does. Statement 3. Reserve Bank of India has now adopted WPI as its key measure of inflation and to decide on changing the key policy rates. Which of the statement given above are correct? And now you can easily understand how inflation becomes important for UPSC, especially the prelims stage as well. And let me assure you that this is not very easy question. It requires you to have a clear-cut understanding of CPI, WPI and how they are different. And so we will begin with that comparison, and then we will go on and understand how we calculate inflation and then what are the factors which are driving the current inflation rate in our country. And let me tell you this important coincidence. In the DNS dated 4th of January 2020, which is like 8 months before the prelims examination, we discussed this chart which has all the information it takes to solve this question. And so we'll start the discussion with the same comparison chart between WPI and CPI. So WPI is measure of inflation at the wholesale level, whereas CPI is the measure of inflation at the retail level. So you know that buyers exist both at the consumer level, which we form important part, because we don't go to the wholesale market for vegetables. We go to the local retailer or the grocery shop. Whereas the business people, the people who are involved in business, have to go to the wholesale market. And so the markets exist at two levels, and hence the inflation exists for these two different markets. And so that is why the calculation of WPI is done by Ministry of Commerce and Industry, because that is not something which is impacting the consumer directly. Of course, indirectly it does. But that is an easy way to remember who calculates WPI, because it is for wholesale market, and so Commerce and Industry Ministry is the one concerned with it. Whereas the CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, is calculated by National Statistical Office or NSO under the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. For both of them, the base year is 2011-12 and 2012. Now, the basket of goods under the WPI is different from basket of CPI. Because under WPI, you have primary articles, manufactured products and fuel and power. And highest weightage is given to manufactured products. Whereas if you look at CPI, the one which is consumed or centered around consumers, consists of what we consumes or what we spend maximum on, which is food and beverages, pan, tobacco and intoxicants, clothing and footwear, housing, fuel and light, miscellaneous, which includes services of education and healthcare, and transportation, which is also a service. But the highest weightage is given to food and beverages. So on an average, an Indian household has the maximum expenditure on food and beverages, and that is why highest weightage has been given in the CPI to this particular category. Now, when the food prices increase, which is what is happening now, will it impact WPI the same way as it does CPI? Of course no, because you can see that the highest weightage is given to manufactured product, and so the impact of increase in food items is less on WPI as compared to CPI, since the WPI provides higher weightage to manufactured products and lower weightage to food items. Whereas the impact of increase in food items would be much wider on CPI because it has the highest weightage of foodstuffs. Now, as you can clearly see, there is no health, education and transportation here, and so under WPI, there is no service sector which is included, but it forms an important part of the CPI. Under WPI, there is no inclusion of taxes, whereas CPI has the inclusion of taxes. Now, we know that RBI has been given a mandate to maintain the inflation rate between 2 to 6% or 4% plus minus 2%. Now, what is this value, whether it is WPI or CPI? Now, the government does not want the average consumer to face the inflation at a very high rate. And so it makes sense that RBI is required to maintain CPI rate of inflation of 4% with a deviation of 2%, whereas RBI does not take into account WPI. So RBI targets inflation rate, which is CPI. And so let us now go back to the prelims 2020 question and try to solve it. The weightage of food in consumer price index is higher than that in WPI, which is correct. We have seen that. WPI does not capture changes in prices of services, which CPI does, which is also correct. RBI has now adopted WPI. No, this is wrong, because RBI has adopted CPI as its key measure of inflation and to decide on changing the key policy rate. And so the statement 1 and 2 are correct, leading us to the right answer A. And so often students ask about the base effect. What is this base effect? Now, to understand the base effect, we'll have to go through some calculations. You know that rate of inflation in current year depends on the rate of inflation in the previous year, because the rate of inflation is equal to prices in the current month minus prices in corresponding month of the previous year divided by prices in the corresponding month of previous year into 100. And so if the prices were very high in the same month last year, which means that denominator would have high value, and so you will have low rate of inflation because of base effect. Similarly, if the prices were very low, unusually low in the same month last year, your denominator will be low and hence your rate of inflation will be high because of the base effect. And so let us understand these two scenarios. Under scenario 1, let's say price of an item A in 2019 May is 100 rupees, and in May 2020 it is 150 rupees, and in May 2021 they have increased to 200 rupees. So how are you going to calculate the inflation? For the first year, inflation would be calculated for May 2020. It would be done in a way by applying this formula. Prices in current month, which is 150, minus prices in corresponding month of the previous year, which is 100, divided by prices in corresponding month of the previous year, divided by 100, which is 50 by 100, which is 50% inflation. And similarly, if you apply the same formula, it comes out to be 33.33%, because then you are going to subtract 150 from 200 and divide it by 150 into 100. Again, to show you how the base effect changes the whole game, you have the same starting point and the same ending point, but the middle point is different. So let's say for an item B, it starts at 100 just like item A, but in May 2020 it was 110. So rate of inflation was 10%. In May 2021 the prices have gone up to 200, just as the way item A has gone. But item A has 33.33% inflation rate, whereas item B has 81.81% inflation rate, just owing to the base effect, because the base would be 110 in this case and 150 in this case. And so this is what is known as base effect. And so let us now quickly understand the reasons behind the inflation in our country right now. And there are 4 reasons behind that. Imported inflation, increase in certain food items prices, increase in services prices, and low base effect, which we just understood. So increase in global commodity prices such as crude oil, edible oil, all of us are feeling this particular instance of higher crude prices. And so since most of the things are being transported on crude oil, and so of course the increase in the prices of petrol and diesel would be reflected in everything else. Similarly, there are certain food items which are getting expensive, for example eggs, edible oils, fruits and pulses. Similarly, the prices of health, transport and communication sector services have gone up, and we know that services are included in CPI. And due to lockdown last year, the prices of most of the goods had declined because of the low demand. And so that is why we have low base effect, which would reflect in higher inflation prices. Also at the same time, aspirants often come across such terms such as headline and core inflation. Now, headline inflation simply refers to the inflation in the CPI or even the WPI, covering all the categories of goods and services. So that is complete CPI and WPI. But on the other hand, the core inflation excludes the volatile categories such as food, fuel, in order to measure the increase in the prices of goods and services in general. So you know that due to various reasons, some or the other component of CPI and WPI would deviate from the general trend. So for example, if the rate of inflation in general is low, but for let's say sudden reduction in rainfall, the prices of vegetables shoot up. But that is quite temporary, but that will take up the overall inflation trend high in that particular month. But that is not what is the general trend, and that general trend is called the core inflation. And so a drastic fall in the food and fuel prices can bring down the headline inflation by a large extent. However, the core inflation may remain unaffected. So don't get confused. RBI right now is targeting CPI headline rate of inflation, which is the complete CPI and not the core inflation. Now, a debate which has cropped up in last 2 years is that what should be actually targeted by RBI. whether it is headline, which is what is RBI doing right now, or should it resort to targeting the core inflation, because which is what is the normal trend. And so in this regard, Economic Survey has highlighted that the sole focus on CPI headline rate of inflation may not be appropriate on account of number of reasons. And accordingly, it has recommended that a greater focus on core inflation is warranted because of 4 specific reasons. First, headline inflation may take place due to volatility in prices of crude oil and food commodities over which RBI has no control. For example, failure of monsoon, lack of cold chain infrastructure, supply side bottlenecks usually lead to increase in food prices. And accordingly, RBI changes its monetary policy, which is going to have no impact on this particular inflation. Similarly, increase in crude oil prices, the import of crude oil prices is not connected with the monetary policy of RBI. But RBI is changing its monetary policy as a result of these increase in prices. Then second, most of the time inflation in food commodities is transitory and may not require any policy change by RBI. It could be just a 1-month phenomena. But RBI comes up with a policy for 3 months, and so that could not be justified. Third, if the RBI tries to control inflation due to volatility in prices of food commodities, it can prove to be counterproductive. For example, to control inflation, rate of interest would increase, which will lead to decline in investment and consumption expenditure, which will result in economic slowdown. And lastly, to measure inflation correctly, weightage must be assigned to different categories of commodities depending upon their share in the household expenditure. Higher the share, higher should be the weightage. And the share of food commodities in household expenditure has declined since 2011-12. Yet the CPI gives a weightage of around 45% to food commodities, as we have already seen. So I hope with this discussion, it was clear to you as to what the inflation, especially the WPI and CPI differences, headline and core differences, and how the base effect impacts the rate of inflation. Let us now move on to the question of the day. The next news which we have taken has appeared on business page. RBI adds a standing deposit facility to normalize liquidity. So in its latest monetary policy, RBI has decided to keep the policy rates unchanged and continue with the accommodative policy stance. However, one of the important announcements was with respect to introduction of SDF, or Standing Deposit Facility. So what exactly is SDF and how does it work? And in order to understand SDF, we first have to understand how reverse repo work. As all of us know, reverse repo is the rate at which RBI absorbs liquidity from the economy. Under this route, the banks can park their surplus funds with the RBI and earn interest which is equal to the reverse repo rate. However, when the banks park their funds under this route, the RBI would be required to give government securities or GSECs as collateral to the banks. So the problem with the reverse repo route is that the RBI has to provide GSECs every time the banks provide funds. So reverse repo has 2 transactions in a complete cycle. In the first leg of a transaction, RBI borrows money from the banks and in return submits or sells government securities as collateral. When banks need that money back, RBI repurchases the same government securities from the bank and gives them equal amount of money which was first borrowed by it. This completes the transaction. The problem with the reverse repo route is that the RBI has to provide government securities every time the banks provide funds. During times such as recent demonetization, the RBI may not have adequate GSECs to absorb huge amount of liquidity from the economy. Hence, to handle such a situation, the Urjit Patel Committee had recommended for the introduction of new tool known as Standing Deposit Facility. So the introduction of Standing Deposit Facility required the amendment to the RBI Act. In this regard, 2018 Finance Act introduced as a part of budget amended the RBI Act 1934 to enable the RBI to use the new tool of SDF. Subsequently, the liquidity management framework adopted by RBI in February 2020 has decided to use SDF in India. However, RBI had so far not notified the operational details. Now, RBI has notified it. So basically, SDF works very similar to reverse repo. However, SDF would be different from reverse repo in following ways. Under the SDF route, the RBI would not be required to provide GSECs as collateral to the banks, Hence, it would enable RBI to absorb huge amount of liquidity from the economy without government securities acting as collateral. The SDFs would be available for parking funds with the RBI on an overnight basis, but the duration of reverse repo could be longer. Deposits under SDF shall not be considered as balances eligible for maintenance of CRR, but shall be an eligible asset for maintenance of SLR. Presently, reverse repo rate is around 3.35%, while the SDF rate has been fixed higher at 3.75%. At the same time, SDF would replace the fixed rate reverse repo rate as the floor of the liquidity adjustment facility corridor. The SDF rate will be 25 basis points below the policy rate, that is at 3.75%. So during the earlier regime, MSF was 4.25%, repo was 4%, reverse repo was 3.35%. But under the new regime, MSF still stands at 4.25%, repo still stands at 4%, but reverse repo has been moved to 3.75%. The last news which we have taken for today has appeared on page number 10. Navy crew completes training on MH-60R helicopters. So the first batch of Indian Navy aircrew successfully completed its training on MH-60R multi-role helicopters at the US Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego last week. The helicopters built by Lockheed Martin, which is the company which manufactures these machines, are being procured under Buy Global category of the procurement procedure through foreign military sales route of the US. It is the most capable and mature anti-submarine warfare, anti-surface warfare multi-mission helicopter available globally. It will provide India the capability to perform anti-surface and anti-submarine warfare missions. It is capable of launching Hellfire missiles both from right as well as left extended pylons. It is basically a replacement for the Sea King 42-48 helicopters decommissioned in 1990s and are envisaged to operate from frontline ships and aircraft carriers. Then this last news has already been covered in great detail by Baswa sir. So the tax revenue in the union budget for 2021-22 was estimated at rupees 22 lakh crore. Against the union budget estimates of 22 lakh crore, the actual revenue collection has increased to 27 lakh crore. The actual figure is almost 5 lakh crore above the budgeted estimates. Further, for 2021-22 marks the highest tax-GDP ratio of 11.7%, with direct tax to GDP ratio at 6.1% and indirect tax to GDP ratio at 5.6%. Baswa sir has already discussed the tax to GDP ratio, its components, why is it low or high in our country, in his Economic Survey 2021-22 discussions of part 1. So it is expected of you that you already have gone through that lecture. If not, do not delay.